Part 4. Religious conflict came with the colonists, but not a lot. From the beginning, religious migrants brought the Old World religious disputes with them, but the New World structural differences made the outcome very different. This was a time when every country used state coercion and state violence to enforce state-approved religion. Any new or different denomination could expect not just disfavor, but maybe jail and possibly death. European religious violence between 1500 and 1800 was exceptionally bloody. Just as an example, between 1618 and 1638, the 30 Years' War was in Europe, a war between Protestantism and Catholicism. It killed around 8 million people, maybe 10% of the population. England was not safe from this violence. The Protestant-Catholic conflicts of the early 1500s, when Elizabeth died in 1603, morphed into disputes between different sects of Protestants. By 1642, those conflicts resulted in the English Civil War between Oliver Cromwell and Parliament and Charles I. Partly to mostly a religious war between Anglican royalists and Calvinist dissenters, it resulted in years of violence and waves of migration to America. From the beginning, in the colonies, it was true there was some official religious violence and a fair amount of unofficial religious conflict. 3 examples. In 1659 and 1660, Massachusetts executed 4 Quakers for the crime of being Quakers in Massachusetts. In the Salem witch trials of 1692 and 1693, the Puritan government executed 19 people, most of them women, for witchcraft. And in Maryland, in 1689, in a short-lived war with no casualties, Protestants revolted against and overthrew the Catholic-friendly colonial government. But overall, compared to the Old World, there was relatively little official religious violence in the colonies. There were a number of reasons, and all of them helped to set the conditions for the separation of church and state in 1787. To start with, the very nature of Protestantism, with no central authority and with the right to do your own scriptural study and decide what truth was for yourself, meant a constant froth of different sects. England's size meant there were a lot of these groups. Even though they were unlicensed and unapproved, most of them were somewhat tolerated, but still frequently suffered official disapproval and state sanctions. Moving to where you would be left alone was always attractive. Thus, when England began to seriously colonize North America, starting with Jamestown in 1607, there was a constant outmigration to the colonies. Once in America, nature took its course. The new colonists tended to develop religious differences and break up, just as they did in the Old World. The result, by the Revolution, was an extremely diverse America. One study shows by 1770, only about 20% of all congregations were Congregationalist, Puritan, and another 15% were Church of England. The rest, about 2/3, were a mix of many other Christian groups. This was a relatively tolerant live and let live religious culture. This was partly driven by reality. The colonists had powerful incentives to develop social norms against escalating religious disputes to violence and against using state violence. Survival was a major factor. America was a hard land. Surviving meant depending on your neighbors. Partly it was because many of the colonial charters mandated both Christianity and religious toleration. And partly it was because of structural reasons. State religion in Britain had 1,000 years of deep roots, vast wealth, and enormous institutional authority, and the Crown was willing to use it to enforce the national religion. The colonies had none of that. In the formative years, the colonies had a lot less people than England. In 1650, Britain had a population of about 5.6 million people. Virginia, the largest colony, only had 27,000 people. And all 13 colonies together only had about 50,000 people. And the colonies, with a constant stream of new colonists, constantly expanded westwards. The vast differences, combined with lack of official resources and interest, meant much weaker colonial government and religious institutional authority than there was back in England. That expanding, spreading population was a real mix of official and unofficial sects. In 1750, for example, Thomas Barton, a Virginian Anglican missionary, was sent to proselytize in Pennsylvania. He reported, somewhat sadly, that Lancaster County, with a population of about 2,500 people, had only about 500 Anglicans. The rest were a mix of over 10 different denominations. These churches and members bought land, built homes, paid taxes, and brought money into the local economy. They were officially and unofficially full members of the community. Having theological arguments was common, but using state power to enforce religion was usually a step no one wanted to take. The result was an American culture where official religion existed, but there was little ability or will to use state power to violently suppress non-official religions. Thus, no matter what was happening in the old world, or how many arguments over predestination there were at the local tavern, there was little official state violence.